The steady-flying, easy-to-handle Jenny, standard Army trainer, was the barnstormer's favorite perch. Although some of the more reckless civilian flyers gave aviation a black eye, most of them helped America lead the world toward the air age.
We are in the Golden Age area of the San Diego Air and Space Museum. We're just past the World War I area, and in back of me is the Jenny, the JN-4 aircraft made by Curtiss. It also had a Curtiss engine, the Curtiss OX-5 originally. This airplane made about 90 horsepower to 100 horsepower, depending on the engine. It weighed about 1,600 pounds, and they made over 6,000 of these airplanes. It was primarily a trainer in World War I. Hundreds of pilots learned to fly in this airplane. Because it was not used in combat in Europe, there were many of them left over. Remember, we did not actually enter World War I until 1917. So there were hundreds of these airplanes left over, and they were sold to civilians for as little as $50 a piece with engine. The result was the men coming back from the war, we had a lot of pilots coming back, we had a lot of mechanics coming back, and they decided to earn their living by the thrill of flying, doing air shows and that sort of thing. This airplane was not particularly good with 100 horsepower, but you add the Hispano-Suiza engine, which was a significant airplane engine was used in the SPAD in World War I. They vastly improved the performance. The airplane itself, with this engine, it's an unusual engine in that the valve gear is all exposed, and before you fly it, you have to shoot all the valve gear with a can of oil to provide proper lubrication for the engine. The Hispano-Suiza was a much better engine, obviously. The competition for it was the Lincoln Standard. The Lincoln Standard was a very similar airplane. I know somebody who flies both of them. The trouble with the Lincoln was it had a bad engine. It had an engine that had a tendency to catch fire in flight, which is not a good thing in an airplane made out of paper and wood. The max speed of the airplane was about 90 miles an hour. And could fly maybe at 200 miles or so. It was the principal airplane used in the early mail service. And there's stories about the early mail service and how it got started, but that's a different part of the story. It was restarted by the Army as a trainer in 1927. Now, the previous airplane was the JN-3. The JN-3 was almost exactly the same. It had less horsepower, but it's also the first American airplane to fly in combat. And the combat occurred because Pancho Villa invaded the town of Columbus, New Mexico, with about 500 soldiers, or insurgents, whatever you want to call them. General Pershing went after them with about 1,000 men and went into Mexico. There were numerous battles, but the principal point was they used JN-3 to find and locate Pershing. They had 5 airplanes. As I understand it, the airplanes came from here, San Diego, and the pilots came from San Antonio. The airplanes were well used and pretty well worn out. They flew from Columbus, and they left Columbus around sundown, and it was October, so it had to be a full moon, and they flew down to a little town called Mata Ortiz. Only one made it. One returned, one crashed on the way, one they never found again. The trouble was they were flying in high mountains with these airplanes that were just not very perform at all. Some of the pilots went on to become fighter pilots in the First World War. But it's interesting that the first combat airplanes was the JN-3, the predecessor of this airplane here, the JN-4. This airplane was used in the movie The Spirit of St. Louis, flown by Lindbergh himself. In fact, Lindbergh, this is the first airplane that he flew. From the story about Lindbergh, he purchased one without really being able to fly it, and then kind of learned to fly it on his own. He did fly it. Also, he flew the Lincoln Standard, and the story was when they completed the movie, The Spirit of St. Louis, the stunt pilots were supposed to fly down the main street of the town, and none of the stunt pilots wanted to do it, so Gurney actually flew it. Lindbergh was in one airplane, but it was actually Gurney, because Lindbergh wanted to avoid the mob of people. If you want to learn more, come to San Diego Air and Space Museum.